and people. It was people intended to be on that plane. But meanwhile, back at my grandmother's house,
Yeah, yeah.
my uncle. Oh, so this man that I met, I'm sorry, not at grandmother's house yet, still fast forwarded to a few years ago when I met the rancher. And the next day, I took a friend with me to this man's house, and we recorded him talking to me. We recorded an interview, but he had said, we both worked for Air America. I said, "Where were you?" He said, "We were in Laos. It was the winter of 68 and 69. I was like, that's exactly when I know he had to have been there. For him to have known he could jump out of that plane, he had to have practiced it. He had to practice the jump with the parachute that he used in this hijacking. And it was like, okay, you're legitimate. You're for real. Well, while I'm interviewing him, I said, how long have you known he was the hijacker? And he said, from the day they first, that Thanksgiving, and they put up those those drawings of him.
Yeah, the initial
I'm using his words. He said they put up those drawings. They didn't really look like him, but they looked enough like him that I turned to my wife and I said, "I'll be damned. That's old Linus." And when he said that, I have this video of me just like my heart stopped. I went, "Linus, oh my God." The only time anyone ever called him Linus was that day with those walkie-talkies. And Dewey was saying to him, "Linus, can you hear me? Come in, Linus. Linus, can you hear me?" And I'm laughing because I'm a little girl who loved the Peanuts comic books. My dad had a book of Peanuts. And I said, if you're Linus, Dewey is Pigpen, because Dewey was a slob. And I just thought that was so funny. It was like, Linus, I loved that. I thought that suited him, so I'm calling him Linus and I'm getting to use the walkie-talkie. Yeah, Linus can hear you, and Dewey's coming back. But until the rancher said this to me, I had completely forgotten it. And he said, "I gave him that name." Well, apparently, and he said, and it stuck. And I went, "Oh my God, who else knows about Linus?" And that was what led me to finding this general and et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people knew him as Linus. That was one of the names he used when he would do secret missions. But this person, this rancher, had given him that name in the winter of 68 and 69. And actually, they were together for quite some time. He has since revealed, more of the story that I won't know until he's dead and gone. But they spent a lot of time together. But so it's back at Grandma's house. Linus and Dewey are walking with me out in the woods, and they pack up. They take off, they leave. They left the duck blind behind. It didn't go with them. They're driving a car. I thought it was a Triumph. I think it was some kind of, my brother said that somebody else had a Triumph when I was growing up, and I'm probably just confusing the car. But my brother, who's a car nut, said that, Dewey actually had a sports car. He had was it called a Mach 5? It was a Charger, I think.
Yeah,
and a classic
Mach
muscle
3.
car. Yeah, Mach 3. Okay.
Mach 5 was Speed Racer.
Okay. You can tell how much I know
confusion. Pardon me while I belay my nerdiness.
It's okay. I'm glad you got the facts straight. I've got my facts, but that one has always been a little blurry to me, because what happened next is, they leave, they're gone, and they're supposedly on this hunting trip. And when they come back the next morning, I'm waiting outside. It's early morning, and I'm excited to see this turkey. I've never seen a turkey that was, had feathers on it still. And I'm thinking they're going to be here any minute. And I don't know where everybody else was. I really think that my brother and sister were at other grandparents' houses. My mother's mother, her stepmother and stepfather were still alive, and they lived somewhere and nearby. And I had, my aunt and uncle were in town, and they could have been in two or three different places, but I don't remember anybody else being there with me on the driveway when I'm waiting. I think that my mom and my grandmother had gone to the restaurant where my grandmother worked in town to cook the turkey. Because there was nobody in the kitchen. There wasn't anybody around except me and my dad that I can remember. And I'm waiting outside. They drive up in this car, and I go running to the car. I think I was up in my tree where I like to sit and spy on people. And, I go running to the car, and I'm like, where's the turkey? Where's the turkey? I want to see the turkey. And I look in the car, and here's LD, and he's in a white T-shirt. He's covered in blood. He's bruised. He's beat to hell. And I mean, it scared the crap out of me. I was like, oh my God, what happened to LD? And Dewey said, we were in a wreck. And, Dewey's been drinking. He stinks like alcohol, which he did a lot. And I said, the car's fine. That was my remark. The car is fine. There's nothing wrong with this car. And he's like, go get your dad. He's yelling at me to get my dad. And I'm grilling him. I'm like, but LD, he's hurt. And he's like, Dad, Marla, go inside and get your dad. And I go running inside, and I'm like, Daddy, come here. LD's hurt. And my father comes out, and he tells me, wait inside. And of course I don't. I'm spying from around the corner of the house. And he said, I heard Dewey say to him, our money problems are over. We're rich. We just have to go back and find the money. We dropped the money. And then I'm like, we're rich? How cool is that? And I'm dancing and skipping around the yard. I'm like, wow, maybe it was worth him getting hurt, And it's kind of funny because this is how I remember it. But, it's these investigative journalists who are these people real involved in the case are like, her story just doesn't hold water because how can you go from one emotion to another? Well, it was a highly, highly emotional morning. Anything was possible. And I'm a naive little kid. It's like we were dirt poor, and suddenly my uncle's saying we're all rich. And I'm like, yeehaw, that's fantastic. Well, my father is just furious, and he's cussing at Dewey. He's saying, you stupid son of a bitch. How could you do this? And he's over on the side of the car where LD is. And he said, Dewey, you've got to get the hell out of here. Mom can't see him like this. You've got to get out of here. She'll be back. Get out of here. And they leave. And my dad takes me to the back of the house, sits, he goes, we've got to talk. This is very, very serious. And he sits me down on a stoop that actually had a door behind it that was boarded up that went into LD's bedroom. And he said, Marla, Dewey and LD have done something really terrible. And it's so bad that if anybody found out, LD would die for what he's done. And he goes, and he didn't really do anything that hurt anybody, but he would die. He said they would kill LD for what he has done. And he said, you can never tell anybody about this. It is a matter of life and death. You cannot talk about this. That's a pretty heavy thing to lay on an 8-year-old.
Yeah. I was going to say that's more than heavy.
Yeah. So here we are. It's Thanksgiving Day. My mom comes back, and my dad, the great actor, trying to keep cool. I'm sure he's drinking like a fish. probably trying to calm his nerves, which it wasn't uncommon. My family, not my mother, my father drank, and he became an alcoholic after this, and as the years went by, his drinking just became heavier and heavier until
the
a
burden of
miraculous
knowledge of such
deliverance.
things can do that to somebody.
Yeah, you just kind of want to bury your feelings and escape. And I think that was the way Dad escaped for a really long time. The last 15 years of his life, he really had a miraculous turnaround. But for the rest of the time my parents were married, there was just steep decline. And my grandmother came back, my mother came back, and there was a turkey on the table. I later learned from Dewey's stepdaughter that they drove 23 miles to her mother's house in Bend, where her mother had been up all night making a Thanksgiving dinner that was to be served as a breakfast because they were going to have a big old celebration about something. And instead, when Dewey arrived, her mother had gone to a neighbor's house for something, and Dewey came into the house drunk and furious and destroyed the Thanksgiving dinner, threw the turkey on the floor, knocked the kids down. He was beating up on the kids and telling them, get down there and eat that turkey like the three little pigs you are.
And this is all stuff that you remember from your childhood. It's not things that it's not some of the things that you piece together, like finding out that your dad worked in Army intelligence.
No, that part like that. I knew that he had worked in Army intelligence growing up, that he had, what his service had been. And that was in his obituary, that he had worked in Army intelligence. Sure. But the part about where they went after they left my grandmother's house came from a cousin, from the girl who would become Dewey's stepdaughter. I don't think that Dewey was married to her mother at that time. He actually might have been. This girl's memories were pretty jumbled. She had a drug history and a very violent life, and apparently Dewey had sexually molested her, which I wasn't aware of, until this girl came out of the woodwork, and I will not say her name. Sure. I give her a fake name in my book, but the incident that she described on a Thanksgiving day, and after this, she had to go out to the car with her mother and Dewey and help bring LD inside. And they were searching for bandages, whatever they could find to bandage his wounds. And when there was nothing more to use, she as any 9-year-old girl, this is how old she was then, would do, comes out with toilet paper, and they, tell her how stupid she is, that you can't, bandage a wound with toilet paper. And, it was a very traumatic thing for her, of course, as it was for me. But, in the months that followed, and I guess eventually at that time is when Dewey took LD to a VA hospital, and he received care for his wounds. But, she remembered Dewey and LD, primarily Dewey and her mother, going out on these logging roads, driving for miles and miles and miles, and dumping the kids out somewhere, and with the truck, and just walking out into the woods. They were probably looking for the money, because as my father had said, Dewey's, we'll get to that in a little bit, but so back in 1971, the day of the hijacking, there's this very, very uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner that happens where my grandmother is wondering where her other two sons are. And meanwhile, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade has been canceled, and all that's on any of the news channels is the search for Dan Cooper. And here are these composites being shown who look like my father and his brothers. And I think my grandmother knew. Dewey's ex-wife, Doris, actually called the FBI and said, you need to look at my ex-husband and his brother. The pictures look like them. And, they were reported, more than one person reported them. And actually, the cousin, the same stepdaughter, told me that sometime after the hijacking that men in black suits appeared at my grandmother's house. This was after we had moved away. Yeah. And took Dewey off for questioning for a very long period of time. She, as a child, she said it seemed like it was several hours that he was gone. And when Dewey returned, he was white as a ghost. Dewey, frankly, was an arrogant prick. And when he comes back to my grandmother's house, he is scared to death and takes Wink, who was her mother, and Wink's 3 children, puts them in the back of a worn-out pickup truck that has a wooden camper on the back of it. And they don't even go back to their house to get their pets, their clothes, nothing. They leave on dirt roads and they travel through Oregon, up into Washington State, and they camp on the beach for a while, catching crabs to eat until somebody, she thinks it was LD, showed up one day with money, and they crossed the border and stopped at a place where the kids were instructed to find the heaviest coats and gear they could find. And they bought a tent and they went off and they hid out in Canada for some time until, I believe, until my grandmother got really, really sick. And by this time we had moved to New Mexico and then to Colorado. So my dad moved our family as far away from the investigation as he could. And my grandmother died November of 1974. But I really think that I don't know how long he was in Canada. I just knew that he was gone. LD had left the Christmas after the year after the hijacking. So Christmas of 1972 was the last time that I saw him. But life went on, and there was upheaval, there was depression, there was fear, there were lots of hushed conversations constantly, among people. My dad with his brothers. It was kind of funny. The year that the hijacking happened, on our way back to Spokane, we had stopped to visit the youngest brother who, I don't think he was at the Thanksgiving table either. Maybe he was. I don't remember. The year after the hijacking, he lived next door to us and we lived directly behind my grandmother for that whole year. And that was the last that we saw of LD, was during that year. But on the way out of town, going back to Spokane, we stopped at Wendell's house where he lived with his wife, Charlene. And he had these 2 Doberman pinschers. They were Dominic and Domingo. And he had built this castle for them with a moat. He was quite a cabinet maker. He was a wonderful carpenter. And he had just this yard that was this magical wonderland of a dog concourse to play with. And it was kind of unforgettable. But I just sort of forgot about it until my story came out in 2011, and this long lost aunt, Charlene, called the FBI and said, "Oh, Marla's mistaken. She lived right behind her grandmother, and I lived next door to her." Well, that was a year after the hijacking. And she said, there was nobody questioning. She's full of it, whatever. And the FBI called me and said, "What do you think of this?" And I said, "Well, I have my school transcripts, of the year of the hijacking say that I was in Spokane. I didn't live in Sisters at that time." I go, "But I wonder why she would go to all that trouble." Well, and here's one of those wonderful, mysterious parts of the story. I've said that I felt like the hand of God was just on me to find out, and still to this day, as if, there's so much more to be told. I'd love to find anybody who knew him as Linus and hear, more of the stories I don't know. But I'd had this dream probably early 2000s that I found a treasure chest full of family heirlooms in an attic. And it was so real. I woke up just my heart racing. I was so excited. And that was like, oh, wait a minute. Where was I? Where's this attic? Where's this treasure chest? What happened to all my family stuff? And I was like, gosh, well, one grandmother's house had burned down when I was a little girl, so she didn't have anything like that. And my grandma Irene, who was the mother of my dad and his brothers, her house had been destroyed as far as I knew. It actually was recycled. All of Brooke Scanlon Camp, where she lived, had been built from, it's very in vogue now to repurpose rail cars. Well, it's nothing new because all of Brooke Scanlon Camp was houses made out of rail cars. And my grandmother's house was 4 rail cars put together, I think 4. But her house had been carted off when Brooke Scanlon got demolished. There was this beautification project in Sisters, Oregon, and they put these facades on all the downtown buildings and made it look like this sweet little old West town. And grandma's house got hauled off and is now, is somewhere else. A lot of those houses got repurposed for cabins that people can stay at. But I had no idea what happened to my grandmother's belongings. I'd had a quilt when my sons were tiny that I just wore out washing because I swaddled them in it. But, as far as I knew, nothing of her belongings existed anymore. Well, when I went back to Oregon, my Uncle Dewey's late wife, who I'd had a conversation with during the investigation, who told me some more things that were really fascinating, she took me out to her garage and she pulled down an attic ladder and she said, if you'll climb up there, right about there is a suitcase for you. And so here it is. It's 2011. And I'd had that dream 10 years earlier, probably. I don't know exactly when I had it, but I climbed up into this attic and come down with this steel suitcase that had been my grandmother's, and it was full of photographs and cards and letters, and it was amazing. And I found a really special album that I think my mother had put together for my grandmother. My grandfather died when I was 10 months old. It was 1964 of a heart attack. He was in his early 50s, and all of the brothers were there for the funeral, and there were family photos taken of all the brothers with their children. And I was a baby, and my sister and I were in a photo with my mom and dad. Well, LD is there with his wife and 2 stepchildren, I think, and then 2. I think there are 4 kids in the photo, if I remember right. And he's wearing like a casual shirt of some kind, and Dewey, sort of the same story. They lived in Sacramento at the time. And I since found out that Dewey I knew then it had come up. They tried to recruit my dad to do some work they were doing. Dewey was actually a bag man for the mob, I found out. And they tried to get my dad to move to Sacramento and get involved in whatever they had going on, and he didn't want any part of it. And but the photo of, here's the fascinating part, and this is where I'm going with the story. Wendell was wearing a suit, and he was of the same stature as LD. He was taller and thinner at that time than the other brothers. He got kind of heavy in the middle as he got older, but he's wearing the hijacker's suit. He's wearing a black suit, black tie, white shirt. Even the tie pin, you can zoom in on it. It looks like that pearl tie pin. And when I get this suitcase, after Charlene has called the FBI, it's a few months have gone by, and she's gone out of her way to discredit me, which I thought was just really strange. Everybody else in the family contacted me and said, hey, here's what I remember. Oh my God, yeah, of course, but not Charlene. And her husband had this identical suit, a few years before the hijacking. And I'm thinking, she probably knew something. She probably was just covering her own ass by trying to discredit me. I think that LD was possibly wearing Dewey's suit when he hijacked the airplane, or I'm sorry, wearing Wendell's suit when he hijacked the airplane. And anyway, so the day of Thanksgiving, 1971, it was pretty hush hush and uncomfortable around the house while that was going on. And eventually we went back to Spokane. My father, sometime after the hijacking, had a friend with a pilot's license who chartered a plane, a small plane that my sister and I went up in with my dad and this guy, and we're flying. I think now we were flying the flight path of the hijack.
The route, trying to find something.
I think so. Because it was really. Go ahead.
Oh, no. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think that it was the only time I flew in an airplane as a child. We didn't travel by air. My uncles did. They always had those little bottles you'd get on the airline with booze in them, and so
nip bottles.
Yeah. So, but there was somebody who reached out to me after my story went all over the place, and his name is Dave Frederick. He lives in Billings, Montana, and he has done such amazing research about the hijacking. And he's the one who actually told me, the flight path and how LD, later in life, he became a surveyor. And he said, of course, the rancher too had said, there was a code that was still in my uncle's wallet, which I acquired. With the time he died, all of his belongings were in 2 suitcases. And a few months after my story went viral, is when Dale Miller contacted me. Literally a professional Santa Claus brought me the gift of my uncle's belongings. He said, your uncle was one of my best friends, and he lived in my duplex on the other side of the wall from me and my family in the last years of his life. And he invited me to come stay with them when I went back to Oregon. And I did. And Dale just, like having family again. But he still had the suitcases that were LDs that were locked up in a closet in that duplex. And I took pictures of everything he had. Dale still has the suitcases, but there was this long code written out in Uncle LD's wallet. And it was this series of numbers. I published them in the book. And Dave Fredericks took that code, among other things that he instructed me about the hijacking. But he took, and even the rancher had said, those are coordinates, Marla. He said, if you'll get the old Forest Service maps from that era, we can map those coordinates. And I mean, it was a long series of numbers.
Latitude, longitude, hour, minute, all that kind of good stuff.
Well, but it was, you'd have to look at the code. It doesn't look to me like latitude and longitude, but the way Dave broke the code down, it made perfect sense. And it was, very close to where the hijacker is believed to have jumped. But it was Dave Frederick who told me he knew exactly when to jump out because, at that time, Mount St. Helens was still a mountain. And it was roughly 10,000 feet tall. And then you had Mount Rainier, slightly higher. And by dictating, we're flying to Mexico in that plane at that altitude. He said, you're going to fly at 10,000 feet, no faster than this. There was only one flight path out of SeaTac to go south. And, to get to Reno, they had to fly the Victor 23 flight path. And that flight path along the way passed by St. Helens and Rainier, where the peaks of those two mountains would line up like sighting the scope of a rifle. where you would know exactly when to jump. And the FBI told me he had probably, a mile, maybe a 3-mile space to patrol to find him. And if he had a flare to set off when he got there, it'd be easy to find him.
Well, and what's interesting is that, number one, you said that your uncle was an experienced pilot.
No, skydiver.
Skydiver.
Yeah.
And had done things in Korea, stuff like that. One of what crossed my mind was the idea of how those line up like a rifle sight. You said one of the tools that they used to use in World War II was a Y yoke with 2 sticks on it. This was before the days of radar. It's what bombardiers used to be able to basically line up 2 geographic points as a reference in front of them as to when to release their bombs so it would hit on target. So kind of the same method. It's a method called dead reckoning, where you're using 2 stationary objects as you're moving closer to them as a point of reference to a third location. And even the fact that having that kind of experience in the military, number one, anytime you're going to be a paratrooper, do any kind of shooting, you're going to go through a survival course, and you're going to have different methods of evasion, different methods of concealing the information that you're carrying, such as codes. So let's say that your objective is 23 degrees north latitude by and 10 minutes by so-and-so west latitude. You would code it some other way. And the same thing with, like you were saying, your father being in Army intelligence. Same kind of thing. It strikes me really sharply, the fact that y'all moved as much as you did, and yours is that he was a lineman for the county, so to speak. But at the same time, jobs like that are the kind of jobs that they put people who are in witness protection. That they put people who are actively involved in intelligence, because there's a reason for them to move regularly. It's not strange for them to move from county to county in the same state. And at the same time be able to get intelligence, be able to get sensitive information. So yeah, just some really interesting family lineage there. Just how those lines cross to make a web.
Let me go back for just a second, because this is a kind of an interesting part of the story. As I was writing the book, I kept thinking about, for some reason, I couldn't shake when we went to see, because we didn't go out to movies a lot. It was when I was little, my parents would take us to the drive-in, but, I think everybody in the whole wide world went to go see the movie Airport when it came out in 1970, 1 year before the hijacking. And that just kept popping into my head. It was like, I knew what a hijacking was because of that movie, because I had just seen it in the movie theater the year before, when I was a pretty little kid to be taken to that kind of movie. But, everybody saw it. Everybody in the U.S. saw it. It was written by Sir Alex Haley, who worked in British intelligence. And it was based on a book that had been published in 17 languages. And here we are with this all-star cast. It had the largest marketing budget of any movie at that time that had been made up until that time. The plane that was used in the movie Airport was a plane that was owned by the Flying Tigers, which is the CIA. It's the CIA. The Flying Tigers was what moved cargo. Air America moved people. And so, I don't think it's common for the military to loan out their planes for Hollywood to be making films about it. But as an adult, this thing just kept haunting me. I was like, I really need to look at this. And this was before I knew much about propaganda. And I watched this movie during the writing, and I went, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we were living in Seattle. There's all this talk of, we've got to make the airport bigger, and how we needed airport security. We've got to have airport security because this guy could just get on the plane with a bomb in a briefcase, and he's a soldier suffering from PTSD. And, they come up with this plot to get the bomb away from him because they somehow get, the wife of the soldier, she figures out this guy's going to hijack the airplane. She tries to stop it. They come up with this scheme. Jacqueline Bisset is,
he's pregnant with Dean Martin's version of Airplane.
Exactly.
It's like a fear-mongering version of Airplane, ladies and gentlemen.
Exactly.
That's Airport.
That's how that happened. You're funny. So anyway, it was like, okay, this is the propaganda piece leading up to the real hijacking to get us all nervous, and so when this really happens in real life, people are going to freak out and insist on we have increased airport security.
Not just that, how many people were actively out pulling off hijackings before the movie came out?
Well, there were some. There were some.
But
you want to talk about that now?
The rash.
Well, there were far more after the hijacking, but I believe, which leads me to, what I spoke to before we were recording. I really believe I've learned just in recent months about something called Operation Northwoods, which was a CIA operative that got past the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They thought it was a great idea. JFK shot it down and said, hell no, we're not going to stage fake hijackings to drag us.
Yeah, hijackings, bombings, all kinds of insurgent activity.
Fake plane crashes, all kinds of stuff. The document's unbelievable. The marketing that was going around trying to drag us into a war with Cuba was something that was, it was like, boy, many, many, many false flag things. I believe JFK got knocked off, and this directive actually happened and was sent to a private industry like Blackwater, and still fulfilled, because between the years of like 1964 and that decade leading up to the hijacking and then following the hijacking, where you had these quote copycats, which I think were just identical scenarios to what my uncle had been assigned, and I believe it was an assignment. I'm going to drop a bomb here. I think Ralph Himmelsbach was my uncle's handler.
Wow.
I think that he protected my uncle, and is probably what kept him alive was Ralph Himmelsbach feeding the media a line of bullshit about his character, about his whereabouts, about what sort of a guy he might have been. Yep. My uncle, by the time of the hijacking, was an old asset.
Until it comes to the point that it's a cold case, and every once in a while there's somebody new that picks up cold cases, and it pops up on the news that so-and-so just joined the Bureau in this capacity and picked up the reins of the old D.B. Cooper case. We'll see if they do anything about it.
Right.
It's really interesting, because even what has never rung to me ever about the narrative of the night of November 21st, the night of the hijacking, is what freaking airline carries $200,000?
Oh, well, no, that wasn't how that happened. The money was actually at a bank, prepared for incidences, according to Ralph Himmelsbach's book that he wrote, which is just one big propaganda piece, in my opinion, but very valuable to have. Ralph's book, he said, there was money actually held at this particular bank for incidents such as kidnapping and things like that. So, supposedly that money was held at that bank, at this particular bank. Now, if you read
But see, even that in and of itself rings in the fact of somebody that's being handled.
It's exactly. Well, and then the most interesting part in the book, and this is when I realized this is staged. It was completely staged. I went. They knew
36
who the hijacker
people
was.
on a pretty busy plane on one of the busiest travel days in the country. Even back in 71, don't get me wrong, folks. I'm not saying that we had like the air traffic that we have now. I'm not saying that it was with regularity that people flew. Like, that was still at the point where, like, hey, you still dressed up when you went to the airport.
Exactly.
Like, it was still a thing, you know? Like,
right. Well, what was fascinating to me about this book was that in one of the pages, Ralph blurts out, there's this one communication that nobody could explain. Nobody knows who said it, but it happened. And it's that when the courier was getting ready to bring the money to the parachutes to the plane, he said the communication comes from Northwest Orient headquarters in Minneapolis to the tower at SeaTac. Be sure when you take the money that the courier is not wearing his uniform, because our friend, referring to the hijacker, has a previous arrest record for drunkenness, and we don't want him to think that this is a cop delivering the money. And I went, holy crap, this communication happened on the first leg. This was while the plane's in flight. Nobody knows who the hijacker is. They didn't know the name of the hijacker until they took roll after the passengers were all released. And then they look at the
as
flight,
far as who was missing.
Right. And then they look at the manifesto and they figure out, okay, it's this Dan Cooper guy, which of course is a fake name. His name was Lynn Doyle Cooper, not Dan Cooper. But somebody knew of his arrest record, and Ralph explains this in his book. He kind of dismisses it. Oh, the airport, the FBI computers were doing their job, and I was like, bullshit! What a bunch of bullshit! They don't know who the hijacker is. How could they be doing a job? And this was what was so funny. When I was being interviewed by the History Channel, and here's Tom Fuentes, the former assistant director.
But that sure is, unless he's already in the system, and he wouldn't be in the FBI system for a case of public drunkenness. Unless he's already in the system, how's the FBI computer doing their job to identify him?
Well, and not only that, it's not his real name, and they don't even know the fake name yet. It's when the plane is first in flight. It's like, it's so obvious. And so I looked that up. I went to the transcripts. There's this guy, Sluggo, who has a website, and you can actually pull up the transcripts and see the actual transcripts. And it's so fascinating to read, especially based on, what there was this guy, Jack Rowland, who was a snitch for the FBI, who told me, oh, Ralph Himmelsbach and I, we were old buddies. This guy used to, he named names, and some of those names are still in office. And he said, oh yeah, when somebody, was in financial trouble, they'd pay me to, go steal their car and drive it into the Columbia so they could collect on the insurance, or to burn their house down if they didn't want their wife to get it. This guy was just I call him con man Jack. Right. He said, Ralph used to come and get me in his private plane. And I have a picture of Ralph in his private plane. And we'd go flying all over the place to talk to people in the DB Cooper, about the Norjack investigation. We'd fly here and there and everywhere. And Ralph told him, this is a bunch of crap. We know the guy's dead because we sewed his parachutes shut. We, the FBI, sewed his parachutes shut. And I was like,
as though they knew about it and did something preemptively to prevent the crime. Though that would be legal.
Yeah. Well, here's the narrative. The narrative is that, we accidentally supplied him with a parachute that was intended for classroom purposes only. And, and that was part of Ralph's narrative, or, part of the official, well, I don't know, it's probably some of those DB Cooper sleuths who, have their agendas. But, they said, oh, if he really was a seasoned hijacker or a seasoned paratrooper, he would not have chosen this particular Navy back 6. He would have gotten a sport type of parachute that would have been easier to maneuver. And the fact is that was the best chute for this jump in that weather. And it was the one he was used to. It was the one he had jumped with when he jumped using when he was in Laos. This was the right parachute for the job. But
well, at least for him.
When you look at the transcripts, which you can pull up on this website, if you Google Sluggo, Norjack, you'll find his website.
I'm here to tell you, folks, the day that, and I say it all the time on the show. I told you earlier, even about the FBI investigator that retired. I Google stalked him. It's what I do. That's how I find my guests. I hear people that are interesting, and I hear their story somewhere and go, "Oh yeah, oh I'm gonna find them." And I will, and you can ask my wife, like she does podcasting as well, and she gets her guests in a totally different way. And she's like, wow, like the effort that you go through to track some of these people down and to find them, and reading article after article after article and byline after byline and references and finding it. And then, wow, you stumble across them and you find them and you end up finding their personal page and connecting with them. And it's just, to have connected with you in such an organic way and to have heard this story today. Like I said, I've heard this story since I was a kid. And it was one of those that blew my mind to begin with. And then to hear your recounting of things, even in the much, much edited format that it was in the documentary piece that was done, to hear your story today, and to hear the facts that you're laying out, to hear that you just and I want to thank you, number one, for telling me about the issue with the page on Dudes and Beer. While we were on air and talking, I actually fixed that link, so it's actually up. You can go and go to Dudes and Beer /knowledge / declassified, and you'll find all of the awesome declassified government documents, including Operation Northwoods. And to hear you mention that tonight, before air and then on air again, the possible connection with that, and the fact that there were numerous hijackings up around that time, and it's right up around a decade after the assassination of JFK and the initial proposal of that plan, and how that is an absolutely perfect amount of time, because like nowadays you could probably wait a couple years and people would just plumb forget. You know what I mean? Like the attention span is much less. People are much less involved. They don't necessarily even know who their local candidate is running.
Right.
Whereas people are grandparents, your parents' age, my grandparents' age, we're much more attuned to that kind of stuff. People would have been run out of town on rails back in the day. Where it happening the way it is now, people in the pocket of corporations doing that kind of stuff. And to hear you tell this story, and to be able to see this in really a fractal element, the connection of this story, of this hijacking with the FBI, with his work in the CIA, in the past, in Laos. It's very, very interesting to start rabbit holing. And it's interesting that you bring up this website, just to come back to where I segged from there. The day I started looking you up and initially invited you on the platform I did before I found you on another social media site, I went down the rabbit hole of his website.
Oh, well, if you read the transcripts on Sluggo's website, there's actually that point where the communication comes through. And you can look at the timing of the hijacking. And, if you read Himmelsbach's book, which was called Norjack, and he describes events in one way, and then the flight transcripts, if you and understanding what Conman Jack said too, that they sewed up the parachutes, and there's a narrative that is happening between the flight attendant and the hijacker. Tell him this, tell him that, tell him this. And, one of the things he says is, they dumb so much down too in the media. He was familiar with the terrain. He knew that it was only 20 minutes to McChord Air Force Base. I can imagine how that actually went. Where the fuck are my parachutes? It's only 20 minutes to McChord. Why aren't they here yet? That's how that went down. It wasn't, oh, isn't that pretty? Look, there's McChord Air Force. It wasn't that. Yeah. It was, where are my parachutes? But what happened is, after that statement is made about our friend, having this previous arrest record, you can clearly see where the transcript is spliced. It's cut. And the next Roger is 7 minutes after that remark comes through. And so much of the transcripts, is like
a long time for acknowledgement of signal, folks.
Yeah, and especially with that handy little cut where you see the type, kind of slant a different degree at an angle. And it's like, wow, this is so shoddy of a cover-up of this conspiracy, and there's more. I mean, you can look at other documents related to the hijacking and the investigation that are out there, and it's like, what is blacked out, regarding the propaganda surrounding it, people ahead of time, trying to interview people at the airlines about a hijacking that hasn't taken place yet. And those are all blacklined in the FBI documents. You can't read the results of these strange things happening. But it was when you know for sure who it is, which I do. It's like it makes the rest of it so transparently, pathetically concealed. That we were such blind sheep, 50 years of blind sheep. And then even, the FBI tells me, we know he did it. We're closing the case. I go straight to the Associated Press. It's on USA Today the next day. It's on the Today Show. And I don't know where those articles are. Google it,
folks. You can. I'm here to tell you, just Google DB Cooper niece. That's all you got to Google. And you will see articles from ABC News, Daily Mail, Washington Post, New York Daily News, NPR, like AJC, Daily Beast, Forensic Magazine.
and
these are the people that got a hold of Marla for her story.
Or they just, reiterated and regurgitated the narrative.
Marla, I have to use terms like, reputed or, things like that, so that people don't go, oh, listen to this jackass.
Right.
And I'm sorry, because I spent my time learning to see things in that fractal aspect and reading numerous news articles and being able to go, okay, here we go. Let's distill this. And like you said, once you see this truth in front of you, once you see this map laid out of not just connection of family, like you were saying, where there's your dad who worked in military intelligence, your father, and this is a common thread, folks, in military families, where whenever one person is brought into intelligence, if another person's in another branch of the military, you may as well bring them in too.
Right.
It's like it's not like they aren't going to talk.
Right. And
if they're going to talk to anyone, it's going to be their brother. It's going to be their cousin.
Yeah.
Something like that. So you may as well adopt it and use both of them as assets.
It's true. And what was fascinating to me, though, is when the History Channel documentary came out, and it was such a bogus piece of crap. After I filled you in. I know we don't have time to go into it. Maybe we'll do another.
No, we have time to go into it if you'd like to go into it.
Okay. All right.
We are yours. We're yours right now. I want you to take as much time as you want. I am on no schedule whatsoever. This to me is some of the most riveting conversation I have ever had, Marla. Because like you have first degree connection, number one, to a whole world and panoply that people are just not aware of.
No. And, like people will say, oh, it's such a fascinating story. And I go, you haven't heard the story. You don't know the story. You know a narrative, but you don't know the story. And the story is so much more fascinating than what people have any clue about. But what's interesting to me is, when I became aware, my big aha moment of, okay, not only was he assigned this truth has been concealed. I've told so many aspects of what you and I have talked about. I've told to and more. There's more. We barely scratched the surface.
And let's get into that some.
Okay, we will, but I just want to throw this out here. After I watched the documentary, and then, there's this big reveal, the day after the documentary airs, and I watched that documentary and I looked at my friends I was with and I go, oh my God, we are like the Germans living in Hitler's Nazi rule. This is such a propaganda piece of crap. Knowing, the months that had gone into making that documentary, the backstory, the evidence I had given to them, where the flight transcript was cut, how obvious it is they knew the identity of the hijacker. It was never a mystery. Somebody knew all the time. And, I'd provided that. They had spoken to this retired general who filled them in on my 45-minute conversation with General Charles Edmiston about how Linus had ran this supply operation for Air America throughout the Cold War years. I don't know what else Charles Edmiston said to them. He gave me a long list of spies to talk to about their work in Turkey. He alluded to some things. He said, I'm sure you can find other people who knew him. And, I haven't even followed up with those leads that he gave to me. But, all this information that was given to the History Channel and the story developer just chomping at the bit. And what was interesting when I'm going through the preparation, which was months with the History Channel, and being interviewed by this story developer. And she said, you have so much more detail than anybody else. She goes, but man, there's this one guy, this Tom Colbert, that he's adamant, his guy, Bob Rackstraw, is the hijacker and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, she's telling me all of this. Well, I get a phone call from this old friend, a family friend. He'd been my sister's boyfriend. He reaches out to me on LinkedIn, which, by the way, sorry, I missed that message. I just found it today. So I didn't mean to ignore you.
No, perfectly fine. Fine.
So this family friend reaches out to me. How are you doing? What's going on with the DB Cooper story? And I said, I'm, working with the History Channel on this documentary. Really? I really want to talk to you. Well, this guy actually makes movies. He's a filmmaker. He's a producer. He's, comes from a very, very wealthy oil and gas family in Texas. And he dated my sister for something like 13 years. And he's, he calls me, he goes, tell me what's going on. Cause, Maureen, my sister, he goes, I've never seen her just react so upset that you were doing this. Some of my family members were very uncomfortable with me coming forward, and especially my sister. She was just, oh my God, he could still be alive. What if they come and get him and throw him into prison? And I'm like, oh my gosh, Maureen, for all we know, he's probably dead, because nobody lived very long in our family. And I said, but who knows? He might be homeless and could use a good meal. Come on. I said, I would like to know what happened to him. I want to find him, at least this way we can find him. Well, they were together during this time, and this friend, I'll call him G for short. He knows who he is, but I don't feel at liberty to share his name. But G said to me, oh my God, I want to get involved. I want to get involved. Let me put you in touch with some people. And so he puts me in touch with Alan Nevins, this agent who participated with a documentary film that G had made, and also with Steve Bannon of Breitbart Entertainment.
Oh, wow.
And Steve Bannon calls me, or Glenn has, G. G has me call Steve Bannon. And I'm telling Steve Bannon the backstory. He's like, he said, he said, nobody's ever solved this case. The FBI still says it's an unsolved case. And I said, yeah, but they know it was him. There just isn't enough evidence to convict him, which we'll talk about that in a minute. He said, he said, well, and I go, let me tell you what else about the case that I know. And you and I have not talked about this, but the daughter of A.J. Truitt, her name was Karen Truitt. She was one of the people in D.B. Cooper world who reached out to me. And Karen was 10 years older than I am. So I was 8 at the time of the hijacking. She might have been 8 years older, but she was like a teenager when the hijacking happened. And it caused horrendous stress in her life. Her father was on the plane. Her father had a job working for GSA in the state of Washington. And she said, my father had a pay grade of whatever. He probably made, what would be like making $60,000 to $100,000 a year in our world. And she said, and yet we lived in this certain very, very, very affluent neighborhood. All he did was go to work, come home, and every now and then he'd have to go on these training missions, and he'd be gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And they went to church. He came home. He went to work. He went to church. He came home. That was it. That was their life. They had no friends. They didn't socialize. But when Dad died, they had enough money to donate to their church to build like this wing on their church. And she said, the terrible thing was Dad was on that plane. I always felt like he had something to do with the hijacking because he was on the plane, but he was also in LA when Bobby Kennedy was killed. He was in Dallas when JFK was assassinated. He was in Memphis when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. And she goes, and the hijacking.
Shaker.
Yeah. So the hijacking was the last straw. So she said, after that, I just really didn't want to have much to do with my father because I knew there was something far more, he never talked about his work. He couldn't talk about his work, but for years after the hijacking, sort of like with my family, the men in black suits would come visit her wherever she would be working. People would come sit down and just start talking to her and kind of grilling her, finding out if she was, talking, if Daddy was telling secrets or whatever. And her father was long gone when I met her, but she reached out to me and we became close. We spent time together when I traveled back to Oregon a couple of times, and Karen has passed away since then. She had really bad heart problems, but I'm telling this to Steve Bannon, and he's like, oh yeah. And then did she talk to you about the little men in the little green men and whatever? And I mean, he just completely mocked me. Right. Yeah. I said, you can mock if you want. This woman had absolutely no motives and, no motivation whatsoever for telling me the things she told me. And indeed, her father's on the plane. He's on the flight manifesto. You can look at him. And, she named a couple of other names of his colleagues who were also on the plane. And I was like, it wouldn't be so hard. I said, but just the facts of the plane, of how many and the timing of it and, what was in the transcript, I just gave him kind of the A list of why I really believed her and why I believed there was far more to the story than what the public has ever told. But so this History Channel documentary comes out and I'm like, oh my God, not only have they just completely dismissed me, they did this beautiful editing of Tom Fuentes and Billy Jensen, and their take on what I said and make it look like they think I'm a crazy woman, which I know they did not. And And I'm thinking, okay, I've always dismissed this to bad editing because that's what I was told. Oh, it's just bad editing. This is deliberate concealment of the truth. And this is, they've completely dismissed the general's story. He's not even in there. And yet
at the very least, it's complete concealment of data.
Absolutely.
Which, despite anything, what you need, positive or negative, to solve any case is data.
Data. It's very well said.
Data. And if somebody is coming forth with a story, and not just a story, but one with absolute connection, with absolute, at least proof of some connection, and anecdotal evidence to say
even if you don't believe my uncle's a hijacker, I don't care. Just look at the facts.
Check out the background reference.
Look at Operation Northwoods. Look at how many hijackings happened. Look at
not just that. You can look up the fact that your dad worked in Army intelligence.
Right.
You can look up the fact that your uncle LD worked with the CIA.
You probably can't, actually.
Well,
I don't think you can. I don't think that you can confirm any of that. In fact, I know, according to the FBI, his fingerprints aren't even in his military record. His military record has like nothing. It's been sterilized. Yeah. I mean, it might be somewhere, but nowhere that I think anybody's going to get their hands on it. If the FBI doing the investigation couldn't, well, and who knows, they might have been trying to just, tell me one thing to see if I'd stick to my story. I don't know.
I guess aspects of Air America have been declassified, but I don't know that.
Right.
Identities of people.
I don't think they're going to name names. If anything, some people I know have been investigated for war crimes who are actually working for Air America. But, they appear to be criminal, not anyway. But when the History Channel thing happened, I turned to my friends and I said, we are like the Germans living in Hitler's Germany. And I said, you watch. I said, this is propaganda. I know it's propaganda. Why? And I said, you watch. Within 3 days, we're going to hear about the latest, greatest thing in airport security, and it's going to be all over the place. You watch. I said this. Yeah. Okay, so the next thing we know, the FBI finally, 5 years after the fact, officially announces they're closing the case.
They're closing.
We're closing the case. It's 2016, and here's Curtis Ng on there, making the announcement, and he looks just. I'm looking at Curtis going, he probably just wants to throw up right now. Curtis is not. He is not a media. He's not comfortable in front of the camera, and he's probably going, this is such a bogus bunch of crap. I mean, I know these guys. They're held to such a standard of honesty. One of them told me I had to go through a polygraph test that was absolutely grueling, and the one of the agents who had interviewed me said, we have to do that every 6 months. They keep you honest. They make sure you're legit. You're not sharing secrets. You're not a mole, whatever. But Curtis, he makes this big announcement, and sure enough, it's either right after that or the next day. It was very soon. It was within that 3-day mark that I had declared, we're going to hear this. All the major news networks on the same night ran a story on global entry and those eye scanners in the airports and da-da-da-da-da. And it's like, man, they've sure gotten better with their marketing. Now it's like you have to pay to be able to have your identity scanned in these eye scanners. Now you pay. Yeah. It's a privilege to have them know everything about you.
Well, What's interesting, we were recently at a Christmas party. We go to this Christmas party every year. I'm in the Knights of Columbus, and one of my fellow Knights holds a great Christmas party every year on Christmas Eve, and we all get together and have drinks and food, and it's a great extravaganza where we all sit around and just chat. And my wife was chatting to one of the ladies at the party about 23andMe and about how this friend of ours, an older lady, in her later 60s, wanted to go to 23andMe and have her genetics done. And my wife was like, "Oh, no. This was before she read this article, just from things that I had said and just considering it. She was like, "No, I don't, like, no, they technically own your DNA.
Right.
Like they own your genetic code and you're paying them to own it. Like technically." And then she read this article where it was like this woman who was brought up African American, as far as she knows, was African American, went out and had her DNA done, and there is zero Africa in her.
Wow.
And but it's also the fact of the reason why there's zero Africa in her is because very few people from Africa can pay the $1,000 to have this stuff done, so they don't have Africa fully in their database. You know what I mean?
I do.
So it's like, yeah.
It's
so at
true.
the same time, when you're paying them the $1,000, not only are you getting inaccurate data,
right,
but at the same time, they can now sell your stuff to like Bear Corporation so that they can use it for genetic testing on medications, and you get no money on it.
They can clone you.
And good God, yeah, I mean, they can make like little bitty, at least genetic clones that they can test genetic medications on. And if you're like the winning genome, there you go. It's patented, and there's billions of dollars in their pocket, and you just paid them money to take it.
Well, they're not going to do anything to heal us. They're not going to do anything to heal us.
It's just so interesting how easily that is sold as something great.
Right.
When it's fully inaccurate as of right now. Like if Africa isn't going to show up, that's a pretty major part of the population of the world. And if Africa ain't going to pop up in a percentage.
Wow.
Yeah. And she started reading, like, rabbit holing on this article that was like, and she was like, whoa, I'll never go to one of those services now. Oh my God. Like this poor woman's, and the plus side was that through her journey, she ended up connecting, much like you, through your journey of researching this story of D.B. Cooper, the narrative, and your familial story of L.D. Cooper, your uncle, that you've known, and connecting these things, you found family that you didn't know you had.
Yeah.
You know, like this woman is connected. Now she has like an annual family reunion with like 60 brothers and cousins and stuff that she had no idea she had.
Wow. That would be cool. Someday I want to have a reunion with my whole family, because we don't. Dewey's sons reached out to me. I've met both of them again. I remember them from my childhood. The older one, Dennis, who's a world champion harmonica player, told me some other LD stories and some Dewey stories that were pretty interesting. But, the most interesting family member I met, well, I haven't actually met her. So let's talk about what happened after the hijacking. Shall we get into that?
Absolutely.
He left Christmas Day a year after the hijacking. So it was Christmas of 1972. And he had hand-tooled leather gifts for all of us. And he gave me a belt that he had made, and it wasn't finished. He had carved this beautiful design in it, and he had part of the letters of my name, but had not finished it. And when he gave me the belt, he said, maybe someday I can finish this for you. And I never saw him again.
And that's, of course, the image that you have in the related ABC News articles, things like that, where you're showing the picture of your Uncle LD with the tooled leather pieces, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, those were actually have my mother's. It really was beautiful work.
Trey 70s.
He continued doing that. I have my mother's guitar strap, which is the one that went through the FBI investigation. My brother has my father's, and those are the two guitar straps that are mounted on a plywood board that he's holding in that infamous picture of him, really blurry, 1971. But he left, and I did not know where he went. And I would ask every year, every holiday, where's Uncle LD? When's Uncle LD coming home? Is he coming back? And, we scattered, we moved to New Mexico and then lived there very briefly and then went to Colorado for about 3 years. And we had not even been gone for 6 months when we received a phone call that my grandmother was dying, and it was Dewey. And my father flew back to Oregon for her funeral, and LD was not there. Everybody was just miffed. Where is he? Nobody knew where he was. Nobody had spoken to him. Nobody had heard from him. They didn't know where he was. Now, there was a story that came out that he lived in, I think it did say that he lived in Reno. I mean, in my grandmother's obituary, or it said he lived somewhere that he didn't live at that time. I don't remember, exactly what the obituary said, but I found it online. It said that we lived in New Mexico, which actually we lived in Colorado. But anyway, but LD had been gone at that point for a year, and I never knew what happened to him until I went to the FBI and actually with help got them to listen to my story. What were you going to say?
I was going to ask a question. How long after you moved to Colorado was this instance?
With my grandmother dying?
Yes.
She died in November of 1974, and we had left Oregon in like April or maybe even May. It was late in the school year of 1974.
How long between New Mexico and Colorado?
We were only in New Mexico for that's what I'm saying is we left Oregon in like April or May of 1974. And we lived in New Mexico for maybe just a couple of months, 3 months, perhaps. And then I started the following school year in Colorado. And it was November of that school year. So 6 months after we'd left Oregon, my grandmother died. She died in November of 1974. So, and by that time we'd left New Mexico, gone to Colorado, lived there 3 years. Then my parents decided we should go back to New Mexico again. And we were there for about 2.5 years almost before my parents divorced. And that's when we moved. My mother moved us to Oklahoma. So, the moving kind of continued, but we never went back to Oregon. Dad went back at some point and found one of his brothers and stayed with him for a little while when the divorce was going on, but he returned to New Mexico. But I didn't know where LD was. I had no idea what happened to him. And the day after the FBI told me they were closing the case, which was in late November of 2011, this girl who had friended me on Facebook, like so many people did at that time, reached out and she said, I wonder what Lynn's family would think of all of this. And I said, I don't know. I've never met any of them. And she said, well, you've met me. I'm his daughter. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. We're on Messenger. And she said, and I don't appreciate you, accusing my father of these things when he's no longer here to defend himself. And I said, I am so sorry he's not, because I wish I could have seen him again. And, I'd love to meet you. I'm so happy to know he had a daughter. I'd seen pictures of one of his daughters that the FBI had shared with me, but I deliberately did not get involved in their investigation. And we had this back and forth, and she really warmed up pretty quickly. But she said something about how so here's what had happened. LD leaves. I didn't know where he went, but apparently he did move to Reno, or actually right outside of Reno, Nevada, to Sparks, Nevada. That's where he lived for a good part of his life. And he married a woman named Marcia, who, on the day of the hijacking, he's on his composite drawing is on the cover of the Reno Evening Star newspaper. Well, she is on page whatever, because she'd made the an honor roll in her high school. She was a high school senior at the time of the hijacking, and he married her the next year. And he had 2 daughters with her. And of course, we never met them. But while I'm having this Facebook conversation with this girl in 2011, she said, I would have loved to have met my grandmother. I didn't get to go to the funeral. And I was like, she said, but my mom and dad, took pictures at the funeral. I said, they weren't at the funeral. And she said, well, I have a picture. I said, who else is in the picture? And she said, well, really, they're just at the cemetery. And I said, your dad was not at the funeral. It was a big topic of conversation, throughout my life, that he didn't go to the funeral of his own mother. And, that's how much he was hiding. And she said, well, I can't talk to my mother about it because if she knew I was talking to you, she'd be furious. And then she comes back the next day with, she continues this dialogue, and now she's back to being angry with me. And she said, you're just a liar. My father taught me, never to lie, cheat, and steal. You don't know what kind of people we are. You don't know how educated we are. And, my mother actually worked for the FBI. And I said, your mother worked for the FBI? Now, here this girl grew up in Reno, Nevada, where the plane had landed in the hijacking and all the evidence was gathered. And consequence, after this, it was destroyed and lost. The FBI told me, we don't know if we have the hijacker's DNA. All the cigarette butts are gone that had been saved. They're no longer in the case file. All of the case files from Portland and Seattle and Reno were brought to, one central location. After 9/11, there's going to be one place that controls all of the investigative files in one location. And so Seattle is who has the DB Cooper files. And when Portland and Reno sent their files, it was like everything was missing from those files. There was like none of the evidence was there that should have been there. There's even question as to whether or not that's the right necktie that he wore. And I have pretty strong questions that it probably isn't, for something I won't disclose because it's another part of the story that the public doesn't know and isn't supposed to know. But, this girl tells me my mother worked for the FBI and so did her mother. So she's, this woman's 19 years old when she marries my uncle. I doubt she was an FBI agent, but I know she went on to become a counselor. She's a director of counseling. She works with a lot of suicidal patients. She's done a lot of work with people with PTSD. And I'm thinking she got no better training than my uncle, but, kind of explained a lot, that he could vanish. He could be erased, so to speak. His, whatever arrest record he'd had previously, the FBI told me the fingerprints were not in there. And they did tell me it was an arrest record for drunkenness, which I thought was bizarre.
Like we were talking about just a while ago, if him being involved in a program with the CIA, stuff like that, his information would have been scrubbed.
Right.
It would have been absolutely sanitized, and more than likely that arrest record may have been the only thing there. Right.
Yeah. And Curtis later, right before they closed the case, before they officially closed the case, Curtis Ng sent me an email saying, we're not going to do anything further because we actually did find, which, this is contrary to what he had said before. We found his fingerprints and through something else, besides having the evidence of the suitcase, which I guess the FBI didn't know there were actually 2 suitcases full of his belongings. Dale Miller had only given them some toiletries and handed them to them, with his own hands. Here you go. And so the fingerprints they got from these toiletry items, had more of Dale's fingerprints than anybody's. But, there were plenty of fingerprints of LDs, but they clearly said, we don't think we have the hijacker's fingerprints. Very likely we don't.
Really, the only thing closely resembling evidence has been a random few bundles of money that were found on a shoreline a few
on
years
Tina
ago.
Bar. Yeah, it was 10 years after the hijacking, and I'm 8 years old when the hijacking happens. I live in Oregon, and then I end up living in Oklahoma. A little 8-year-old boy from Salazar, Oklahoma, was visiting the Pacific Northwest and found the only money that's ever been found. I think that money was planted there. According to the transcripts, the money was still in a bank bag and in a knapsack inside, and I think he had wrapped it up, somehow in the parachute rigging. I don't know, but my dad said he had it strapped to his body, and Curtis sort of described how he had ripped out some of the ropes from one of the parachutes to tie the money to his body. So it had at least 2 layers around it.
Well, and what's really interesting to me is how throughout all of this, despite people negating your story, people saying your story is bunk, people like LD's apparent other daughter coming out to you and saying leave this alone, you have befriended the former FBI investigators that were working on the case. Like I on the platform where I met you, I actively became friends with one of them.
Yeah. And you can talk
retirement.
You can
now
talk
that I've talked to you,
too.
I'll absolutely contact him to have him on. I think it'd be great to have you both on one.
That would be really interesting. He might be willing to talk about it, but yeah, he actually reached out to me a few weeks ago. I mean, we'd been connected on LinkedIn for a number of years, but he reached out to me a few weeks ago. He was going through a very difficult thing personally. One thing that going through this story has done for me, I started searching for answers to heal my own brain of trauma that I had suffered, because how could I have forgotten so much of this for so long? Really bothered me. And I sought answers. I sought answers to heal my own mind. I wasn't going and looking to investigate the hijacking. I really wanted to know how I could forget what trauma had happened to me personally, that I could forget this. And,
what
that's
was the
a whole other
that
story.
Built the wall that blocked that off.
Do you really want to know?
And sure,
we can say,
sure, if you would like to reveal it, absolutely.
It was really interesting. I had let's just go back. Let's go into that. I told you my father worked for military intelligence. Are you familiar? I'm sure you're familiar with the MK Ultra experiments and PSYOPs and things like that. My dad told me, okay, so I was 3 years old when my father had 3 different jobs. This was before he was in the apprenticeship program to become a journeyman lineman. And somebody who'd worked in military intelligence, his name was Wick, he was doing these mind control experiments on my father and nearly killed my father. My father had a nervous breakdown. We went through we went through bankruptcy. And I don't know that I was even fully 3 years old, but we lived in Bend at the time. We lived in a brown house that set up on a hill. And next door to us was a family. Their last name was Cater. And it was 2014, February 2014, that I discovered a book called The Healing Code. And somebody told me about the healing codes, and I went, I wonder how to I want to find out how to do this, because I'd heard about, this particular woman who was an associate of a friend who it had been transformative. This woman had been molested as a child by her father or grandfather. And, my friend had known this woman for a number of years and, was shocked to learn of her background, because she was the most whole, happy, outgoing, functional person in his world. And he said, when he asked her about this particular protocol, she told him, what really changed my life was the discovery of the healing codes. And so I was like, I'm going to learn how to do a healing code. I just skipped the book. I didn't bother to read it yet. I just went online, learned how to do it. And I thought, I'm going to do this a couple times a day and just see if it helps. Because I'd already done a lot of things. I completely stopped drinking any alcohol whatsoever. It's like, I want to fix my brain. My memory sucks. I want to really remember everything I possibly can remember. And so, I've become vegan. Occasionally I'll eat seafood, but, I really live a very, very clean life. I do drink occasionally now, but I started doing these healing codes, and I had not had a drop of alcohol in 2 or 3 years at that point. And I started doing the healing codes, and I had this shoulder injury, and I went, the shoulder, it just wasn't getting better. It was just hurting me. And somebody I know said, when your body's holding on to an injury, it's because it's associated to it. The pain is associated with a memory that you need to heal. Your body's holding on to that trauma in that particular part of your body for something. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So I started doing these healing codes, and I'm like, it's kind of relaxing, but it takes 6 minutes to do it. And my mother called me one night. It was Valentine's Day of 2014. And I said, she tells me the story. You were such a remarkable baby. You threw away your bottle when you were 6 months old, and you potty trained yourself by the time you were 10 months old. I said, hell, I'm going to put that on my resume.
Right.
I'm a badass if I did all that. And I really got mad afterwards, because I thought, no, I didn't potty train myself. You used to just sit me on the toilet and, leave me there, and I'd fall in, which was traumatic for me. Well, I'm telling a friend of mine this story, and she starts laughing, and I got really mad at her. That's not funny. Oh my God. It was so humiliating. I'd get dragged out in the yard and hosed off, and it was naked, and it was horrible. It was just traumatic for me. Right. And I was just, traumatized by this my whole life. And my friend goes, oh my God, Marla, you need to do one of those healing codes. You're really overreacting to this. And I went, yeah, maybe I do. And so I began doing this healing code. And by the time I get to the third position of it, I flash back to the memory of falling in the toilet, and I start laughing myself. And in fact, I'm laughing so hard, I'm crying. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Because this was a sore subject my whole life. And I went, oh, maybe there is something to this healing code thing. So the next day I'm getting dressed, and I'm getting ready to go to the gym, and I'm putting on this top, and I wrench my shoulder, and it's like, just the worst pain shot through my body. And I flashed back to being 3 years old and having a broken collarbone. And I paused, and I looked in the mirror in front of me, and I literally asked the mirror, what happened to you, Marla? And I stood there looking in my mirror, and it's like I was watching a movie of that part of my life. And, remembering being taken to church because my father had had this nervous breakdown, and my parents telling me later that it had something to do with WIC and mind control. And it was about this same time that I broke my collarbone. My parents had left me and my brother and sister in the house alone while they went next door to the caterer's house to buy a TV, because through the bankruptcy, they'd taken everything from our house. And it was while they were gone that I was jumping on the couch, and I broke my collarbone, and I was in a lot of pain. And it's like it was like I was on the brink of something else, and I stood there looking in the mirror, and I remembered the Cater family and their teenage son. We called him Mikey, and how Mikey had blindfolded me one day and in his bedroom, and he had raped me. I was a baby. I was a 3-year-old baby. So when Dara, my cousin, when this cousin tells me of Dewey molesting her, I freaked because what she described to me, I had witnessed. I witnessed it. And I squashed that. What she described about Dewey anatomically, it's like I got sick to my stomach because I saw that. I witnessed that. I remembered it. I'm not just hearing her telling me this, but I stuffed this, I stuffed this information. And so here I am, and these investigative journalists up in Oregon, not the real ones, but these small time, independent, this one in particular, 2 of them in particular, claimed, that I had stated something about having been, that incest was rampant in my family. But that wasn't what I said, but I got really, really defensive and angry about that because that wasn't the case. Yes, Dewey had, I'm not defending Dewey's actions by any stretch of the imagination, but I didn't even remember this. That wasn't the remark. That wasn't what I had told in my presentation at this symposium where he'd heard me speak. But I got really, really defensive about it. But my only explanation is that I really think the trauma of, what I had suffered literally as a baby. And I think that young man was probably a victim of MK Ultra, that he would take that sort of action on a baby, literally, and I'm not trying to dismiss the sickness in our world, but I think a lot of it was and is still taking place because of things that are still going on that we're not aware of. How do you even begin to explain the timing of all of that? This guy is doing these mind control experiments on my father at the same time that the 15-year-old next door rapes my father's, rapes his baby. And, it was, so I really think that was it. It was I'd suffered this trauma. And then, as an adolescent, I witnessed something else happening. And I don't remember the details, other than anatomically how she had described him. And I went, oh my God, I saw this, and I just remember the guilt and the shame of all of that. And it just got stuffed way, 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 way down. And anything else associated with that life we left behind stayed with it. And
from that point of departure forward, was it was like something entirely new.
We left and we had
that you had adopted.
Exactly. And we had a very different life. The really strange thing, though, is when I lost my virginity as a teenager, and I was reminded of this by that boyfriend I had so loved, my first love. We reconnected, in the aftermath of the story breaking, everybody came out of the woodwork, and he had reached out to me and he said, do you remember the night we actually had sex for the first time? He said, do you remember you made me blindfold you? This was before I remembered, the rape and everything. And I went, I was like, I wonder why I did that. I wonder why I did that. And I said, I remember thinking, if you're going to do this to me, I don't want to watch, something like that. And it was like, but the minute he penetrated me, I remembered, the physical sensation of that. It was like I had flashed back to being a baby. It was like I flashed back to Mikey Cater. And I was so traumatized by having sex with my boyfriend that I was consenting to have sex with that I broke up with him. Within a week, I broke up with him. And I mean, we'd been together for quite some time. And, but I was absolutely traumatized by it. And again, I stuffed it to where even when he mentioned it to me, I was like, wow, that was really weird. I wonder why I did that, but it made perfect sense, learning now about the mind and how we can hide. I'll tell you one more thing. and this was kind of part of that, related to that backstory. I've had there are certain dreams I've had that are recurrent dreams, since I was a baby, literally since I was a baby. And one of them was that I didn't make the connection until, that first healing code adventure related to falling in the toilet, that I used to, if I felt anxious about something like starting a new school, starting a new job, nervous about meeting somebody,
that was the go-to.
I would have this dream that, yeah, exactly. I'd have this dream that I had to go to the bathroom really bad, and I'm out in the middle of everybody and everything, and I'm naked, and all I can find to cover up with is a garden hose. I had that dream my whole life. And so I think it was related to, I'm sure it was related to my mother taking me outside and hosing me off. And I was just embarrassed to be naked, even as a baby. Probably because I'd been violated.
Absolutely.
So there was something I was going to tell you, and now I lost my train of thought, but it was important, having to do with the story and healing the mind.
Ultra, mind control.
Yeah, now it's vanished, but there was something really, really interesting having to do. Oh, the dream. The night before the polygraph test, I had this dream that, it's a recurring dream I've had literally since my grandfather died when I was 10 months old. I would have a dream. Well, when I was a baby, when I was this little kid, every time I'd sleep in my grandmother's house after my grandfather died. And my mother, after this, at the night of the polygraph, after I had the polygraph, I called her and I said, "Do you remember how I used to wake up screaming bloody murder every time I slept in Grandma's house?" And she goes, "Yeah." She said, "I always thought," and they never said this, they tell you, "Oh, it's just a dream. It's just a dream. Don't worry about it. It's just a dream." It's not just a dream. My grandfather was coming and visiting me in my dreams, and it was really sweet. He'd pick me up, he'd walk around the house with me, and I could see other people. I could see lots of people. It's like there was a party going on in that house. And then I would see something that would just freak me out. There'd be something bizarre that it would be like, and I'd wake up screaming, because it's like, wait a minute, this isn't the house. Everything looks right, but it's not the house. I think I was, seeing in the spirit realm more. But so it's the night before the polygraph test, and I'm back in Grandma's house, where I go often in my dreams, and my dad's there, his brothers are there, and the house changes over time. Sometimes it's bigger, it's been expanded, it has a big room off in one direction that wasn't there before. And in this particular dream, my dad and his brothers are all sitting around like a banquette in the kitchen with a table, and I'm like, oh my God, are you guys okay with me, going to the FBI and everything? And Dewey and LD are there, and they're kind of, they don't really talk with words in a dream. It's like you're just sensing what they're saying, but they're laughing. And Dewey says, "Oh yeah, we're going to go catch that DB Cooper bastard, aren't we?" And they're just, having a big yuck about it. Dewey, it's like Dewey was doing the talking. He said, "Don't you worry, Marla, baby. When you go, we're all going there with you." And they start drumming on the table. And it's like this Keystone Cop tune that they're singing together and drumming on the table. And they're going, dun 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 dun, like that, right? And I went outside. I walked away from them, and it's like every object in the house seemed to be alive. It's like every object that used to freak me out when I was a baby, I could go pick up these little knickknacks, and even the table it was sitting on, everything had a story to tell. Every molecule of every part of her home was alive and had a story that I could connect to in this dream. And I then walked to the center of the room where I remembered seeing this freaky chandelier before. And that was the thing that used to really just terrorize me. And as a baby, it was like, what the hell is that thing? And it looked like a giant artichoke or like a pine, like a magnolia pine cone. It was kind of hard to describe. It had these beautiful colors running through it, all these jewel tones. And I remember saying to whoever is with me, there's like the universal mind. I said, "What is that?" And this voice said, or my knowledge became, "That is your brain." And I said, "How could I have forgotten so much for so long?" And this being walked me around to the opposite side of this structure that was hanging from the ceiling. And they said, "You didn't forget. It was just hidden from you for a while. It's still over here." And they walked me to the other side of this thing. And I see like this river of gold running through this artichoke magnolia pine cone. And it's like, wow, and that's when I woke up and forgot about the dream until I put my hand on the gate at the FBI field office to be buzzed in. And I suddenly hear dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun in my mind. And the dream comes back. And the whole time I'm being walked through the field office, it's like, I literally can just feel my uncles and my father, playing like keep away football over my head as we're passing through these hallways and things. But I think that in life we have perfect timing, and there's always a time for every purpose under heaven. I think that my time for the purpose of being able to tell this story, a whole generation had to pass before that story could even come out. And now we're approaching the year of Jubilee of the hijacking, where the debts are forgiven of it. And it's about that time that the story will be told more widely. I'll do a new book where I'll bring in, other people who are willing to talk about it. And I hope they'll talk.
Yeah. And it's like I said, been a very interesting ride for you, meeting FBI agents, meeting suspects, things like that. Just the road of revelation that you have been on.
Wow. Yeah.
Over the last decade is really, really telling. Thank you so much for coming on, for sharing this. When are you, I know you're saying that the book is presently being written. I know you're going to get some more information from other people coming up here soon. We definitely want to have you back on the show after that visit, after some of the new revelations that you have.
I would love that. The book, my intention is to have a large release, hopefully a feature film, for the 50th anniversary, which will be in 2021. But I'm working on the rewrite of the new book. It's not really a rewrite. It's just it's a different book. It's more of the same. But, the DB's niece story was written as a memoir and pretty much was stream of thought as I went through, the initial things that happened. And then I just threw it out on Amazon before the History Channel documentary came out because I was afraid of them, just giving proprietary information. I needn't have worried. They certainly didn't tell anything of my story.
It was a skim for sure. There was a peppering of your story in there. But nothing like what was revealed this evening. And thank you so much for going so in depth. Please, everybody, do make sure to go on and check that out. The link for her book, DB's Niece in the Raw Unedited, a memoir by Marla Wynn Cooper, is available on Amazon. There will be links to it in this episode post, as we always do. We always try to make sure and put it all right there in one place.
Right. And I recommend that you download the electronic version. It's very expensive to print books one at a time, and since it is a self-published item, and I didn't have any money to put into
version, it. The Kindle version is $888. The paperback is $44.44. And
very
that's expensive. Not denying what the price is, because there are plenty of people out there that will support people in their endeavors as such, Marla. because this information is important to get out there. Though it is now a cold case with the FBI and an official case that they have just thrown their hands up with. The interesting that you have information that you have interestingly presented, as I fumble that there, is so phenomenal and so groundbreaking. And so telling on so many different fronts, and the fact that the FBI did have you come in and polygraphed, and that you passed that, and it's amazing, and I cannot wait to hear what these new revelations are that you have coming up. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with our audience in such unabridged detail.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Christopher.
Well, while y'all are online checking that out, everybody, please do make sure to go on by the Dudes and Beer podcast. That is where you can check out not only all the episodes, but also the knowledge vault that we were talking about earlier. Dudes and Beer /knowledge will take you there. Everything from scientific studies, things like this new program where they're saying, hey, you know, we can go like Mr. Burns and block out the sun and help relieve the solar pressure that's going on that is causing horrible global warming. We can spray stuff in the air. Yeah, some of us have been calling that chemtrails for years. And the patents are there. They wouldn't have patents for things that don't exist or couldn't possibly exist. That's how a patent works. So feel free to go on and check that stuff out. Things like Operation Northwoods, like Marla was speaking of earlier. And the possible connections with the D.B. Cooper case, the possible connections with staged hijackings, that kind of stuff. Was the D.B. Cooper case a litmus test? Was her uncle, L.D. Cooper, taking place in what a decade after the assassination of JFK was possibly a ground level launch of a system that had been put into place a decade earlier? That is quite possibly a possibility, looking at stuff like Operation Northwoods. So go check that out at the Dudes and Beer Knowledge Vault. While you're online there, check out our parent network, HC Universal Network. Great shows. We've been doing great replays on Facebook. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. 200 episodes, everyone. 200 episodes. Marla, thank you so much once again for joining us. Until next time, everybody, remember, if you can't be good at it. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Dudes and Beer Podcast. To listen to our audio streams or chat with us live, download the official Dudes and Beer app for Android and iDevices, available on Google Play and iTunes markets. For more episodes, content, and information, visit us online at dudesandbeer.com. You can also find our episodes on Breach.tv, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast service. Dudes and Beer is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. For more about our sponsors and other podcasts on this network, visit hcuniversalnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, everybody, and until next time, drink responsibly.